Welcome, everyone, to Indications and Warnings with Chuck Pfarrer. Chuck and I are recording this show on March 21st, 2025, with our special guest, Professor Rajan Menon. Professor Menon is the Anne and Bernard Spitzer Professor Emeritus of International Relations at the Powell School of City College of New York City. Also a senior research scholar at the Saltzman Institute of Columbia University. He's the author of more than half a dozen books, numerous articles in international journals. And I'll just mention a few of the books that Professor Menon has written. The End of Alliances. You can get that from Oxford University Press. It was published in 2007. Conflict in Ukraine, the unwinding of the post-Cold War order, which he co-authored with Rajan Menon, published in 2015 by the MIT Press. Professor Menon has also visited Ukraine 4 times since Russia's full-scale genocidal invasion began, and he and Chuck are good friends. I'm going to hand it to Chuck Pfarrer to begin this interview with Professor Menon.
Rajan, you follow the war carefully. You write about it in Foreign Policy. You have a very far-reaching appreciation of how this problem started, how it manifested itself in hybrid warfare, how it turned kinetic. What do you make of the latest unprecedented whipsawing out of Washington? How do you see the short-term effects of that, and where do you think that's going?
First of all, Alan, Chuck, thank you for having me on, and I'm sorry it's taken 2 years, but here I am. And you said some very nice things. I'll tell my kids you said that. Maybe that'll boost my stock at home a little bit. I have to say that I did not ever think, and I think, Chuck, we said this to each other over text, that we'd ever find ourselves in the position that we are in. There's always been a kind of ambivalence in the United States about how far to go in supporting Ukraine. But at this point, I think it's safe to say that President Trump is essentially willing to leave Ukraine to its own devices, that is, to the tender mercies of President Putin. And he said as much. He said, classic Trumpism, we have a big, beautiful ocean between us and Ukraine, suggesting that we can walk away with it and Europe can do it. So as I see it, we are now at a turning point where if I were Ukrainian, I would sadly not depend on the United States, and I would depend on Europe. There are certain things that we can do that the Europeans cannot, but let's not forget that they have given almost as much in military equipment put together as we have, and they've trained about 76,000 Russian troops. I think Trump has concentrated the mind. They have decided that they have to really scale up. It's a steep climb for them, but I think they have a self-evident interest in defending Ukraine. I'm not one who believes that the Russian army can march to Tallinn. It's still caught in Donetsk, but I think the Europeans believe that their security and the security of Ukraine is the two are intertwined, and that is good for Ukraine.
Yeah, I don't want to give any appreciation to what's coming out of Washington. I'm one of those guys who's incredibly optimistic, even when evidence proves the contrary. This was apparently effective in concentrating European attention on the long-term problems in Ukraine. Some of the methods that Washington has taken, for example, unplugging Ukraine from vital U.S. intelligence, we saw the Kursk salient collapse in a matter of days. Entirely predictable when you blind one opponent in a fight. How do you think that resonates with Ukraine, but also does that demonstrate maybe European inability to, for example, step in the role of intelligence provider to Ukraine during the war?
Right. There are some respects in which Ukraine relies on us for things that the Europeans cannot suddenly provide. Indeed, there are things that the Europeans rely on for us that they cannot suddenly provide. So the Kursk thing is an example. As you know, Chuck and Alan, there are people here who have been saying since day one, the Russians will roll over the Ukrainian army. And if I had $10 for every time somebody told me that, I probably own an island in the Bahamas or wherever somebody would give me an island. But in Kursk, the Ukrainian, first of all, the Ukrainian army entered Russian territory. Who would have thought that? We're talking about the country that was seen as the other superpower, fighting a country that's manifestly it's inferior in everything except morale. All material things Russia has much more of. So they went into Kursk in August. It took the Russians all this time to push them out with the help of 12,000 North Koreans. Now, remember that we've been told Ukraine has terrible manpower problems. Of course it does. But we're left with the impression that Russia has none. What are 12,000 North Koreans doing in Russia? And what are prisoners doing fighting there? And what are Chechen militias doing there? And why have the Russians recruited mercenaries from Nepal, from Cuba, and from Africa? Now, in Kursk, they had taken back, give or take, 60% of the foothold that Ukraine had in that province. But the collapse that you referred to coincided almost exactly with the cutoff of the intelligence. It's not that the Russian army had this plan on their shelf and they said, now we're going to execute it. They took advantage of an opening, and I think the Ukrainians were blinded and they managed to withdraw. But the point is this, right? Even in withdrawing, the casualties that they exacted on the Russians is tremendous. The received wisdom is a chaotic response. Ukrainians lost a lot of men and equipment. Indeed, chaotic, all of that. But what we don't hear about enough, and we can talk about this, is the Russian side of the ledger. We are told endlessly about Ukraine's problems, very rarely about Russia's problems. But to come back to Kursk, it is a sign that there are critical dependencies. Now think about this, for example. Imagine if Elon Musk would suddenly decide that Starlink is not available to Ukraine anymore. That would create a lot of problems. So yes, I mean, they are the weaker side. They depend on us. And we are in a position to affect the war materially more than any other country that's out there. The Ukrainians are well aware of this.
Alan.
Rajan, having been to Ukraine 4 times and following the war closely, I wonder what your estimate is for how much longer this war will continue. And everybody should remember it's more than 3 years old. The full-scale invasion started 3 years ago, but the conflict between Russia and Ukraine is really 10 years old, since 2014 when Russia illegally annexed Crimea. How much longer do you see this war continuing?
So you will both appreciate that I'm always reluctant to predict things, but I would not be surprised at all if the war dragged on for the rest of the year. Why? First, Mr. Trump has said, well, I'll come into office in 24 hours, there'll be a peace. If he believes that I have a bridge in Brooklyn, I'd like to sell him. But it's a very complicated conflict. But fundamentally, I think that whatever the evidence may show, Putin either believes that he will prevail by sheer dint of numbers, or he believes that a peace that comes short of his original war aims, from which he's never deviated, by the way. He wants all of Donetsk, which he has not taken in full. He wants all of Lugansk, he's gotten most of that. And he wants Zaporizhia and Kherson, he's gotten only part of that. I think he believes that having suffered such enormous casualties, 700,000 dead or wounded, that he cannot come back home with a trophy that's any smaller than the one that he said he wanted. That's the other part. The second part is that even if the United States were to cut off weaponry right now, there are weapons in Ukraine's hands. There are weapons in the pipeline. The Ukrainians have been developing their own weapons. We can talk about that. I hope we'll have a chance to. That's an important part of the story. And so it's not as if they're going to suddenly stop fighting. They are determined to fight. And so therefore, given the Russian motivation, as I see them and just explained, and given that the Ukrainians are fighting for their country, right? I mean, Putin can lose the war, he won't lose a country. The Ukrainians lose the war, they lose a country. That's a pretty powerful motivator. So I would not at all be surprised that the war could drag on for quite some time. And I think that the idea that Trump can get Putin in a room and expect him to deliver any kind of peace that we would consider equitable is a complete fantasy.
No.
I was just going to follow up with a quick question, Chuck, then back to you. What is your estimate of Donald Trump as a negotiator? Your estimate of his character as an American diplomat, especially confronting Vladimir Putin?
I will tell you this. I've talked to enough Russians back in the day when I was welcome in Russia. I'm persona non grata there, by the way.
Congratulations.
I think they don't have a very high opinion. Putin may flatter him, but they see him as somebody who can be ruled. And Mr. Trump, on the other hand, has two worldviews. One is that he doesn't have an overarching philosophy of anything. He approaches every encounter as a potential deal. And he keeps saying over and over again, I'm a business guy. What I do is deals. Now, doing a business deal and negotiating a very complicated peace settlement is, in a war like this, are two different things. So that's one thing. I think he's on the wrong track if he thinks this is just a matter of me getting in the room with Putin and we can solve this Yalta style. Look at the last meeting. He got nothing really from Putin, absolutely nothing, other than a promise to from Putin that why don't we think about a moratorium on energy infrastructure attacks? That's because the Ukrainians have been launching some deadly ones of their own. This was presented as a magnanimous thing by Putin. So that's one problem. The other problem is that I think Mr. Trump, believes that great powers kind of should run the world. Their leaders meet and hash out deals, and that in their respective hemispheres or backyards, if you will, that they can pretty much do what they want and ought to be allowed to do what they want. Hence the eyeing of Canada as a 51st state, hence the saber rattling against Mexico, the talk about annexing Greenland. And I think he believes that in some sense that the Russian narrative about how important Ukraine is and how wrong Russia has been, when Putin says that, it resonates with Trump. So I don't have a particularly high opinion about him as a diplomat, because I think up front already, or a negotiator, he's already conceded certain things to Putin. He said, well, the Ukrainians will have to give up some territory. Now, let's stipulate that they may have to do so. I mean, I think it's going to be very hard for them to claw back all they've lost, all right? But you don't give something like that up front. Or NATO expansion, NATO membership, excuse me. I happen to think that, and these are difficult conversations to have in Ukraine, that I think the door to NATO is almost effectively closed. But again, why concede that up front? What kind of a deal maker does that? I don't understand. Maybe there's some subtlety to the art of the deal that misses, that goes over the head of a simpleton like myself. So that's kind of my sense of him. You know, I've lived in New York forever. We all kind of grew up in a way watching Donald Trump, and I never thought he'd become president. I don't watch much television, and I had no idea that he had this show, I don't know what it was called, which presented him as this great businessman. And I understand now why so many people knew about him and had this perception that if only somebody like him could be put in charge of the country, we'd all be in good shape, because he knows how to run things. Anyone who's worked for him in New York will tell you that he's best known for stiffing contractors.
Right.
So, yeah. So I don't, and also this team of his that he has, right? They're not particularly well briefed on Ukraine. I mean, Steve Witkoff might be a smart guy as a businessman, but he doesn't understand anything about Ukraine. He came back from Moscow having talked to Putin and said, well, I take Mr. Putin at his word. That's always a big mistake right off the bat. And that he's sincere about this moratorium on energy infrastructure being off limits for some period of time, when the Russians had already gone back on that pledge. So there's that. Rubio, probably well brief, but he's done a kind of thing that many people have done lately when seduced by the possibility of working in government with Trump, which is that he's completely changed his mind on. He's kind of done a Lindsey Graham. Now, if someone like McCain were around, maybe these folks would have displayed a little bit more integrity and backbone. But when I look at the group overall, I'm not terribly impressed. The Russians, whatever you may think of them, they have first-rate diplomats. Sergei Lavrov is not a man I particularly admire, but I wouldn't want to be walking down a dark alley with him behind my back. He's a formidable negotiator. So is the National Security Advisor Viktor Ushakov, and so is the number 2 diplomat Sergei Ryabkov. So these are, A-team guys. In other words, they know how to negotiate on behalf of their country. I don't have the equivalent confidence in our team, because the hallmark of Trump 2.0 versus 1.0 is that this time he's surrounded by people who are completely dependent on him and are beholden to him. So no one will stand up and say, Mr. President, that's really not a good idea. And that makes me anxious.
Yeah, it's easy to worry about that. We're going to have a wide-ranging conversation, so I really don't feel like driving it in any one direction. But this was a late-breaking news item that resonated with Alan and I. And all of us, I think, agree that Ukraine's future peace and security must be predicated on military security. And I have been saying that what that really means is the defeat of the Russian army, and to take that cudgel out of Putin's hands. And I was extremely encouraged to hear today that President Macron of France said that Russia needs to be defeated in Ukraine. And that is quite a bit of distance from the warm, fuzzy phone calls that he was having earlier with President Putin. And Rajan, you are our geopolitical expert. What do you make of that evolution in France's view of the conflict?
Don't say that I'm your geopolitical expert. That makes even me nervous. But let's go with that thought, Chuck. It's interesting, right? I think under Trump, what he has said about the NATO alliance and the Europeans in particular has come as a shock. Do you remember that speech that the Vice President Vance gave at the Munich Security Conference? If you had to write a speech that was deliberately meant to antagonize your allies, you couldn't have written a better speech. But the speech was not really aimed at Europeans at all. He was speaking to two audiences. One was his boss, and the second was the MAGA base, because he fancies himself as Trump's successor. Now, Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, didn't insult the Europeans in that way, but he basically said, you're kind of on your own, right? So this is concentrated European mind. So Macron is a different kind of person. He's always talked about defense autonomy and so on, but there's an urgency in his voice now that you didn't hear. Keir Starmer, despite Brexit and all of that, not that he was a Brexit guy necessarily, but the Brits have come to realize that continental Europe is now something which they've got to bond and bind. And then you have in Germany the defeat of the SDP and the coming to power, most likely of the Christian Democratic Party and its sister party, the CSU, and the new chancellor, Friedrich Merz, is pretty tough on Russia. Scholz would not provide the Taurus missile. I think Merz said even before the election, well before it, that if he were chancellor, he would do it, and I think he's likely to do it. So there are some very hopeful signs. Now, some countries like the Poles, who are probably the hardest line on Russia, because if Ukraine is defeated, then they suddenly have Russia as a neighbor, right? There's a testy relationship between Ukrainians and Poles historically, but the war has kind of brought them together. They have a different view, in the sense that they believe that any diminution of American engagement in Europe would be a very, very bad thing. So when Macron and the others talk about Europe's autonomy, Europe acting more in concert, it makes the Poles a little nervous. They've made it clear that they won't station. troops in Ukraine. So we don't have a complete consensus within the alliance, but I think there is a sense now that the 1-800-USA days are gone, and that when it comes to the future of Ukraine's security, if they don't play a bigger role, they cannot expect the United States to fill that place, because Trump has made it. One thing about Trump is he's been very honest about this in a kind of brutal fashion, and that's been like the Kloshar of reality to the Europeans. Hence, your reference to Macron and my reference to Starmer and also to Merz. I think they realize that they've got to do something, and they're beginning to mobilize resources. I think that's what, $800 billion over X number of years. Europeans doing things that we would never have expected. Now, remember, in terms of population, GDP, technology, competitiveness, they've got the Russians beat wholesale. The question is, can they summon the unity that's needed? Because there's no such thing called Europe, right? Even the EU, it's a collection of states. So can they summon the unity that's required to cash in on those resources and develop a long-term strategy to wean themselves away from the United States, whether within NATO or not, outside of NATO, and develop a strategy where they can defend Ukraine? My honest belief is very few Europeans at the end of the day will fight and die for Ukraine. But they don't have to, because the Ukrainians have shown for 3 years that they're more than capable. What the Ukrainians need is training and weaponry. And hence, in the foreign policy piece, I argue the best way to defend Ukraine for the Europeans is to do that. Because so far what they've said is, well, we will station some small forces in Lviv and Odessa and Kiev. In other words, everywhere except where they're really needed. Right? So that's a sign to me that they're not going to be a security guarantor in the sense of going to the front lines to fight the Russians if that becomes necessary. But I fundamentally believe the Ukrainians have more experience now on the battlefield than any other country in the world, certainly in Europe.
You know, that's a really wonderful point that Alan and I drive home quite a bit. This is the first 21st century war. Things have changed. Technologically, it's a multi-generational leap, right from a kid making a drone in a garage for the first time. Now it's turned into the most lethal and effective weapon on the battlefield, first-person drones. And I agree with you, Rajan. The Ukrainians, first of all, they don't need 20th century military backup. They simply need the tools.
Right.
A little comment about
just very
please
briefly. This may come up, but let me just bring it up anyway in case it slips my mind. The Ukrainians, even back in the day, were fairly prominent as arms exporters. They had, even before the war, a shoulder-fired missile called the Stugna P, which was a pretty effective anti-tank missile. Well, what's happened now, and you both know this, and maybe the audience does, but it's worth repeating, there's a cottage industry of drone development. I had a friend who was a journalist, and I connected with some people whom I know, and they took him to these drone places, and he came back just flabbergasted how much is going on. But it's way beyond that. So now they've developed this sort of cross between a missile and a drone. It's a turbojet. It's called Pieklo, which means hell in Ukrainian, that has a range of about 435 miles. They're building enough of them to engage in deep strikes. They have the long Neptune. The short Neptune, as you'll recall, is the one that sank the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, the Moskva, in April of 2022, I believe. This one has a range of something like 600 miles, more than the standard ATACMS, more than Storm Shadow Scalp, the Anglo-French missile, and more than Taurus. And it's hard to get details, but a warhead payload, which may be like 250 kilograms. And they have been hitting Russian refineries just in the last week 3 times. And Russian airfields like the Engels 2, where the Tu-95 and Tu-160 bombers take off from. And so there is a lot more strike capacity that they have to reach into Russia now than they have had ever before.
Yeah, it is the first time in military history where a nation without a strategic air force is conducting strategic operations with remotely piloted vehicles.
Right.
And, our joke around here was Ukraine was the brains of the Soviet Union in terms of aerospace, rocketry, shipbuilding. The Moskva sunk off Mykolaiv, which was the port in which it was built.
Extraordinary.
So
Extraordinary.
that
One other thing to watch for, and I don't have any inside information, it would not surprise me in the least if they are drawing up plans to have another go at the Crimean Bridge. I'd be very surprised. Now, they're going to take their time because this time they want to do it right. So we have all kinds of things coming down the pike. Now, will any of this fundamentally shift the dynamics of the war? Is it possible that the Ukrainians will get back all the territory they've lost since 2022, let alone 2014? I will never say never, but color me skeptical. But they will have proven to the Russians that their original plan for subordinating the country, because that's what it was, right? They started off with about 150,000 troops, and they made a beeline toward Kiev. They hived off some territory in the meantime. But the idea was not to conquer all of Ukraine, which is in land area the biggest country in Europe, setting aside European Russia. It was essentially to enter Kiev and carry out a coup d'etat. And they came fairly close because airborne troops, VDV troops, were already airdropped into Kiev. And I asked a friend of mine, so what happened to those guys? Because the armor columns didn't link up with them. And he said to me, let's put it this way, they are no longer with us.
Alan.
This is something of an odd statement I'm going to make. I'm going to say that both Biden and Trump, in different ways, have been too soft on Russia. I find Trump as a negotiator and seeking no concessions from Russia as much, much softer than Joe Biden, who restricted Ukraine from hitting targets inside Russia, which would have made a great tactical difference to them early in the war. Do you see my point about that?
Yes. I mean, he did eventually lift those restrictions for a time, and the Ukrainians did use Storm Shadow extensively in Crimea. But there's no question that they were subject to certain restrictions. The fear here, I think, was of escalation, or the belief that the Russians would overrun Ukraine and then we'd be forced to either just accept it or to dive in and nobody wanted to fight Russia. And I can appreciate those concerns, but, it may be easy for me to say, but I've never particularly worried about the escalation thing, because escalating to nuclear war, all bets are off. Then you've really rolled the dice in a way that is maybe irrevocable. And I see Putin as many things, but I don't see him as a reckless gambler. He's not a riverboat gambler kind of person. He's a much more calculating person. Now, if I were the president of the United States, would I be concerned about escalation? Yes. But the long and short of it is the fear of escalation has been something that has made us very circumspect. The problem, of course, is we were deeply involved in the war as the largest single supplier of arms to Ukraine, a little bit more than the rest of Europe put together. So the question is, what are you trying to achieve here? Right? Are you just trying to have a stalemate war, or are you trying to empower one side to engage in what is its right under international law, which is to defend its territorial integrity? And I don't think we could ever quite make up our mind about what it was that we were trying to do. And that is one reason why the war has continued on as long as it has.
I have always thought, had NATO, led by the United States, immediately responded to Russia's full-scale invasion by deploying American and NATO troops to Ukraine, the war would have been much, much shorter. Not because the Russian military would have been defeated in the field by NATO and American forces, but because you would then have had two combatants who didn't want to be in a war with one another, and they would have negotiated an end to the war very quickly. And it would have put Ukraine in a position to get the security guarantees they desperately need in order to have a future.
Correct. NATO is a kind of an odd animal, right? I mean, it's very difficult in a sense, short of an attack on another NATO member to get it to move. So Ukraine was always in this gray area. You'll remember that in 2008 at the Bucharest summit, the communique had this kind of throwaway line, "Oh, one day we look forward to welcoming you into NATO." And that was agreed upon by a divided NATO only because George W. Bush browbeat them into doing it. Right? So between 2008 and 2022, there was no substantive movement toward getting Ukraine into NATO. They were told in the communique, "We welcome you to join one day, and by the way, the first step will be a map, a membership action plan." They never got it. So my sense is they were never really serious about admitting Ukraine, and Putin knew it. And so those who argue that NATO expansion was the cause of the war have to explain to the rest of us, was Ukraine really any closer to getting into NATO in 2022 than in 2008? I've had endless arguments with people on the other side of this equation, like John Mearsheimer, who's a good friend of mine. We don't agree on Ukraine, but we have good faith arguments. And I have never had anybody tell me, "Well, you're wrong because X, Y, or Z happened." Nothing really happened. Now, that leaves me with a difficult question. And people ask me, "Well, okay, then how do you explain the invasion?" And I have to say that there is something about Ukraine that a lot of Russian nationalists, and that is what Vladimir Putin is, they have never reconciled themselves to the loss of the country. They believe that it was their historical patrimony. They have religious and cultural ties to it. And the idea that it is now irrevocably separate has been extremely difficult for them to deal with. And if you hear the subtext of speeches that those two potted history essays that Putin wrote, let alone the speeches of people like Dugin, one of the main ideologues in Russia today, this comes through very, very clearly. So I think we have to look there, not to the theory that had he not invaded, Ukraine was just about to get into NATO. I just think that's preposterous.
Rajan, let's talk for a minute about that invasion itself. I am always happy to remind people that I was an invasion skeptic before the invasion. I thought that Lavrov and Putin had done magnificently by mustering troops, rattling their saber, and bringing Ukraine, that most Americans at that time couldn't find on a map, brought it to the absolute forefront of world media, national headlines, and that it would be a masterstroke, what they have done. But I thought they won't invade because Finland will join NATO, Sweden will join NATO, the Baltic will close, it will defibrillate NATO, which had turned into the Lions Club. And I felt that that invasion was a strategic blunder, and the military tactics were still up in the air. One of the things I was also saying is this is going to put Russia back 50 years. It's going to throw it out of the community of nations. They'll have to claw their way back in. What part of those predictions were true, and how do you see Russia's future, regardless of how this war ends, as a consequence of the invasion?
Right. So I made two mistakes similar to the wrong calls that you made, because we were all trying to figure out what was going on. As they began to ramp up forces, I really didn't think they were going to engage in a full-on attack on Ukraine. I thought they were going to raise the temperature to the point that they got a pledge that Ukraine would never be part of NATO. And if they got that pledge, then they would say, well, we have a couple of other ideas we'd like to run by you, like a cap on Ukrainian forces and so on and so forth, right? Status of the Russian language. But I didn't think they were going to invade. The second thing is, I didn't think the Ukrainians would put up the fight that they did. Now, people say, well, that's because of our weaponry. It's worth reminding people, the two of you know, before the weaponry really began to flow, in the year 2022, the Ukrainians pushed the Russian army out of Kiev Oblast, Chernihiv Oblast, that is the two northern oblasts, provinces, Kharkiv Oblast, and then in the south, out of part of Zaporizhia and part of Kherson, right? That was an incredible. After that, the war didn't really go that well, and the counteroffensive didn't work. But did I expect that? No. When I was in Kherson, they were actually shelling the city, having just retreated across the Dnipro. And I was really flabbergasted at what the Ukrainians had achieved. So there's a lot about this war. I mean, I will not ever tell you that I saw this coming and I called it all right. Absolutely not. I wish people who have kept telling us that the Ukrainians would be run over like some roadkill from day one would say, well, I have to at least confess that I was wrong about that, but they won't do it.
No.
They'll just say, just you wait. But now it's 3+ years, brother. You have to give some kind of explanation.
Yeah. And you know what? I expected massive Russian advances, but given the size of Ukraine, roughly the size of Texas, it has a major river system going north and south, analogous to the Mississippi. And I knew the Ukrainians had a long and glorious history as partisans. And I felt that if Russia did not achieve its special military operations in 72 hours, that this was going to get ugly. And
Correct.
I will say, Ukraine's conventional military response has encouraged me, but and I am one of these guys who says right now, and I know the history is yet to be made, Russia has lost this war as far as I can tell. They can't win it. Ukraine can still win it, but it's going to take so much more.
Correct.
Rajan, tell us those steps.
I'm sorry, go ahead. I didn't.
No, that was it. Thank you.
Even if you have an ugly peace, that is to say, the Ukrainians are forced to give up territory that they don't want to give up. You know, there's such a thing as partisan war. A friend of mine who was a Lithuanian American reminded me that after the end of World War II, it took the Red Army several years to quash a Lithuanian resistance movement, and I don't think it was only there that they encountered that. So there's going to be partisan activity. The Ukrainians are not going to reconcile themselves to giving up land that they believe rightly to be theirs. There's another side of this equation that we haven't talked about, and that is, again, just as we keep hearing about how dire the situation is within the Ukrainian military, how deeply they are in need of more manpower, and all that I will concede. You don't have to go to Ukraine for very long or look very hard or talk to very many people because they are quite open about their situation. They are not people who are going to tell you everything is fine. It is a much more democratic country than Russia, and people will openly tell you without. In Russia, you dare not criticize the war. It's a crime. You can end up with permanent housing in a remote part of the country. But here's the thing: the interest rates in Russia are now 21%. That's because inflation is 9.9%. Some people think it's higher. The sovereign wealth fund that they've banked away through oil and gas revenues has been depleted by 60%. There's a scarcity of labor because the military-industrial complex has sucked in so many young men that even Vladimir Putin says labor shortages are a very significant problem, and they contribute to inflation because if you want people, you got to pay them more, which means you'll pass on the cost to consumers. And then there are sanctions, right? Sanctions, people say, oh, sanctions haven't worked. Sanctions don't have a good record of preventing a country that is hell-bent on doing something to not do it. But over time, they make it much more difficult. So there are many components in the Russian force structure that depend upon Western parts. Those have become hard to get. The American payment system has been closed off to the Russians. Much harder now to export oil and gas. Gazprom, which used to provide, I think, about 10% of the state's revenue, has posted record losses. Now, does this mean the Russian economy is on the verge of collapse? I'm not here to make that point. I am saying, to your point about having lost the war, because one has to see war as a means to an end, right? It's not just an activity that goes on for the sake of killing. It's meant to achieve some end. You expect that your country will end up in a better place once the gun cease firing. Well, they have lost their gas market in Europe. They've concentrated the minds of the Europeans. Finland and Sweden, who had no thought of joining NATO, are now in NATO. They have permanently alienated the Ukrainians who, before 2008, were divided on the question of NATO expansion, right? So this country that's so special to them, they've alienated. And they put themselves at the tender mercies of the Chinese. And Mr. Trump is not going to be around forever. At some point, they will have a new American administration, and I doubt it'll be quite as congenial to the Russians. So at the end of the day, have they come out way ahead? Well, they have a constituency in some parts of the global south that is very sympathetic to their position, but that's because the global south doesn't feel the war in the way that, let alone Europeans, but let alone Ukrainians or Europeans do. But I mean, can you really make the case that the result of this war has been that Russia is going to end up in a strategically better position? Sometimes I wonder if a genie were suddenly to appear before Putin and said, Mr. President, I can give you one wish and you should name it now. His first thing he'll say, one wish? What do you mean only one wish? But then he would say, dial me back to February 2022 and make it so that I hadn't started the war. I have to wonder, right? I mean, it's been colossally painful for them in every respect. They're using horses and donkeys to transfer equipment to the front. They've got tanks on the battlefield that are almost as old as I am. Very few people are as old as I am. They've got these tanks there. So this is not really a very good showing, it seems to me. I think Russia won't be taken seriously as a military power for a very, very long time. That doesn't mean it doesn't pose a threat to Ukraine, but this is not the outcome that I expect. This is very surprising to me.
Yeah, speaking of about where Russia will end up strategically, however the war ends or however much longer it goes on, what has Putin's war done for his relationship with China? I know that they have signed an eternal friendship treaty, but what is the real relationship between Russia and China? I think China must be feeling it's the ascendant partner.
Right. So presumably all three of us are old enough to remember the earliest days of the Chinese-Soviet relationship and how it's evolved. So it went from complete subservience where Mao Zedong went to Stalin and basically kowtowed because he was the ideological guru, to, by the late 50s, polemics over world revolution and the Chinese belief that the Russians had sold out, that they were status quo, not true revolutionaries, and then open polemics, and then in the mid-60s, a buildup of military forces, about 500,000 on the Russian side, more on the Chinese side, and 69, a shooting war on Damansky Island on the Ussuri River. And then you had a kind of shift gradually, especially after the Cold War, to a kind of rapprochement. And under Boris Yeltsin, I think for the first time they used the word strategic partnership, and that has now become more solidified. But if I were a Russian, I would remember two things. The long arc of history tells me that this is only one phase, and we've had other phases in our relationship with China, that despite all of China's problems in terms of the balance of power, there's no contest about who is the more powerful country. They have territorial disputes with Russia that are not kept under wraps, but occasionally on Chinese maps, you can see Vladivostok, for example, referred to in its Chinese name. I'm not saying that the Chinese are going to declare war on Russia imminently, but if I were the Russians, I would not want to be in a position that my option A and B and C are China. I'd want a more diversified foreign policy. Which brings me back to Mr. Trump. One of the reasons that he and his advisors have adduced for trying to bring peace to Ukraine is they want to peel the Russians away from the Chinese. That's a fool's errand. I mean, think of yourself as Putin, right? Would you want to alienate China, given what I've said about the long arc of its relationship with Russia? And what would be a better bargaining position for you? To alienate the Chinese and jump into the American column, knowing that our politics are unpredictable, or to be in some kind of equidistant position where you have enormous bargaining power. He's not going to split with the Chinese. I mean, it's a complete fantasy. He may, Trump may succeed in repairing the relationship with Russia, largely maybe on their terms, but the idea that they're going to walk away from the Chinese is just ludicrous, I think.
And just one follow-up, Chuck, and then back to you. Trump, it seems to me, actually is endorsing this vision of a new multipolar world. He's blowing up the 80-year-old alliances that have kept the United States and the world relatively peaceful for 80 years. What are those multipolar powers? It's the United States. It's China. I believe that Europe will develop itself into one of those poles. Russia believes itself to be one. And then you have a nation like India. What position do they take in this new world order that Trump is not so much creating, but he's wrecked the old world order. Something's going to take its place. We have no idea what it will be. But India, I am very interested in your thoughts of the role they will play.
So there's a distinction, I think, to be made, at least analytically, between a multipolar world, which I take to mean different centers of power where some may be more powerful than the other, but they're all comparable. We're not in that world because there are two major powers. It's the United States and China. Russia is nowhere in that league. India has got a huge climb. It's got big advantages like a population of 1.2 billion, but that's also simultaneously a curse because you have to lift up all those people and eradicate a whole host of problems, right? And in terms of technology and economy, they've made major strides, but they are nowhere in China's league, not even close. And one of the reasons why Modi, who is something of a nationalist himself, well, everything of a nationalist himself, is so interested in solidifying relations with the United States is that he's clearly concerned about China. Now, I think, in a sense, we're of limited value to him because his problem is in the north on land. We're not going to project forces close to the Himalayas to help him. So I would say we don't have a multipolar world in the sense of 3 or 4 equal states or comparable states. We have a multi-centered world in which there are separate centers of power. I would throw Brazil into the mix if you want, that have their own conception of how they want to operate in the world. Very different from the bipolar world that we had in the Cold War, where you roughly had the world divided more or less into two.
Yep.
Rajan, we've all mentioned here that sometimes we talk to people and they have even if they are well-intentioned, they tend to be very uninformed on the actual state of affairs. Whether they think that Russia is invincible militarily, whether they are not perhaps fully informed on the pedigree of some of the European politicians, for example, who consistently made pro-Russian decisions. For example, Olaf Scholz was a Moscow-leaning Marxist when we were all young and handsome. He evolved into made himself over as a center-left politician. But we see, just taking the example of the Taurus missiles, he was very pro-Russia and probably was as they dragged him out of his office. What I'm getting at is Russia has been a past master at gray zone operations and inflecting the information space. When I lived in Manhattan, there would be great big posters that said constantly, you saw them everywhere, AIDS is a U.S. biological weapon, and had big screeds about it. Those were all put up by the Soviet consulate. That's what it took to inflect the information space back then. Now, we are talking on social media. We are part of the information struggle ourselves. How do you see, and I don't think this is Putin's brainchild, but he is a child of the organization that mastered this. how does their tinkering in the information space, to which I would also include election interference, et cetera, how do you see that threat continuing, and what do we do to counter it?
Right. So a friendly amendment, right? We were all once young, and the two of you were handsome. I never was handsome, but I was young. I'm with you on that one. But here's what I think. When I talk to friends who disagree with me about this war, and we can have a meaningful conversation, they will tell me I had this happen just the other day when I was in Washington, a city that I tried to visit as seldom as possible, but don't get me started. He said to me with a straight face, he said, the Ukrainian army is on the verge of collapse. And I said, have you been following the battle zone in, say, Chasiv Yar or Toretsk or Pokrovsk? And he said, well, yeah, kind of, sort of. There are lots of people who have very strong opinions about things on the battlefield without really necessarily doing much homework. So it seems to me that the Russian narrative, and I'm not saying these are dupes of Russia, but right, the Russians flood the information space with a lot of information on how well the war is going. There is no internal dissent there on the war because of the dangers of running afoul of that government. And so I think there are lots of people who buy the Putin story. I mean, I belong to a listserv where articles circulate, and there's a person who I won't mention who writes on the war. And it almost might as well be a press release from the Kremlin, because there is never, ever any acknowledgement that any problems exist in Russia that affect the war. And you have to be just purblind and willfully unwilling to really seek out information to take that position. I'll readily concede that the Ukrainians have huge amounts of problems. They readily concede it. So I have to ask myself, where do these views come from? Is it some residual reflexive belief that Russia is actually much more powerful? Is it a belief that God is on the side of the bigger battalions and Russia has bigger battalions? Is it some sense that, well, we caused this war because of NATO expansion? I don't, I'm not a psychologist. I don't know what the reasons are. But I suspect that the Russian rendition of the war has more purchase among people who ought to know better, because they are not just the average man or woman walking on the streets of Manhattan or in Canada or in Maine. They're people who think of themselves as followers of international relations. So this goes to your point about the effectiveness. Now, Ukraine probably hasn't been as effective because all we hear in our mainstream press are story after story after story of how terrible the Ukrainians are. And take, for example, the Kursk withdrawal, right? Even in a place like the BBC, they pointed to things that undoubtedly happened. Street and the cut off of supply lines and all of this. Yeah, all of that happened. But you would never get any sense that the Russians took heavy losses, that they were able to cash in on the cutoff of intelligence information to Ukraine. And the very fact that Ukraine had been in a Russian province, understand this, nobody except Adolf Hitler had been able to do this since August. So I have to say that the Russian rendition has had some purchase. But in the ultimate analysis, eventually, the rubber hits the road on the battlefield, and things will happen that I think are going to be very, very hard to predict. My one worry about this is just how far will the United States go under this administration to cutting a deal with Putin over the heads of not only the Ukrainians, but also the Europeans. If he does that, I think it's entirely possible that the Ukrainians will reject the terms of that peace, and that the Europeans will not endorse it, that there will be something of a split in the West, that is between the United States and Europe, and the Europeans will say, we have to get our act together and really help Ukraine stay in the war. Now, can I be certain that'll happen? No. But the way things are going, would I be surprised if that happened? Not at all.
And you have this burning need from our commander in chief to complete this deal. Uh, Anything that Putin or Lavrov signs is absolutely worthless. I mean, we can go back to 1972 and the Biological Weapons Convention. The Soviets signed it. They continued to produce biological weapons to be delivered by ICBMs. They were party to the Minsk agreements and also the Budapest Memorandum. They have violated every security pledge, and they made security pledges, as you know, to Ukraine. What do you think is driving the president? And does he not see the looming disaster of him waving a treaty over his head, standing next to the airplane, like somebody we all know from history, and then having Putin turn around and reinvade, escalate, do whatever? I see that as a looming disaster. Do you share my view?
It's a good question. The great unknown is, what did he learn from his conversation with Putin? Now, he's not going to come forward and say it was a terrible meeting, but remember the run up to it, right? It was going to be these two tough guys in a room and they were going to settle this. And there were visions of Yalta, the meeting, as you know, at the end of World War II between Stalin, FDR, and Churchill about how to manage the post-World War II world. Nothing of the sort happened. Putin gave him zip. He said, I'm not going to accept a 30-day truce. And I have a whole list of conditions, and all of which he knew were dead on arrival. He wasn't willing to settle for a peace that would draw the current battle lines. Had he been able to do that, it would have put Ukraine in a very difficult position, right? He wouldn't even do that. The question is, has Trump realized that I'm not going to get what I want until I put some pressure on this person? Now, why do I say that? There was an agreement recently that could have been renewed. And had it been renewed, it would have made it somewhat easier for the Russians to get dollars for oil. The administration let it lapse. There is some discussion now about providing more air defense systems to Ukraine. Trump said, well, I'll get them from somewhere. You can offer to give it from the United States. So the question is, has there been an in-house discussion? And I don't know, where they realized, we're not going to get Putin to agree to any kind of peace very, very quickly unless we put some pressure on. And there was another Trump way back in the early part of the administration. He said, oh, the Russian economy is going to hell, and so on and so forth. So the question is, what have they learned, if anything? Very hard for me to say. Now, on the question of what will be the worth of a peace agreement? Will it be worth the paper it's written on? So I have two thoughts about this, right? If you think about it from Putin's side, he's lost about 700,000 men dead and wounded. The Russian army is going to take a long time to restock itself. The economy really needs to be put back on track, right? The defense budget now swallows up 40% of the state's central budget. Even Russian banks are reluctant to buy the government's debt. So my sense is that I would be very surprised, and I have to say this carefully because I was surprised when they invaded. But my hunch is that if I were a Russian leader and there was some kind of a peace settlement, I would think long and hard before rushing off to have another war with the Ukrainians for two reasons. First, I've got to lick my wounds and bandage them and recover. Second, you know that you're not going to find an adversary that's going to roll over and play dead. Right? The Ukrainians will fight, and the Russians have every reason to believe that they will do so again. So I would be surprised to see them sign an agreement and violate it very, very quickly. Having said that, our country is not being invaded. Ukrainians' country is being invaded. So it doesn't matter what I say. If I were a Ukrainian, would I be comforted by someone like me saying, oh, don't worry, they'll have to lick their wounds, they won't come and attack you again? No, of course not. You think about the worst case scenario because you're thinking about defending your own country. So I have to be mindful here of what I'm saying analytically versus what would make sense if you were a Ukrainian and had experienced what they've experienced.
Let's say Trump doesn't get his peace deal. And loses interest in Ukraine because he doesn't see any opportunity to remain engaged. He stops American military supply. Europe becomes Ukraine's biggest supporter out of necessity. How is Europe going to take care of the transshipments to Russia from which European national economies still benefit? I think Kyrgyzstan is a fine example of a Central Asian country where European imports have gone up by hundreds, if not thousands of percent. Well, all those European goods are actually being transshipped to Russia. Europe has got to find a way to stop that, doesn't it?
Yes. So there are two things here, right? I mean, how do you engage your involvement with countries around Russia without making it benefit Russia? That's a critical piece of the puzzle. I have to admit that I haven't thought enough about that, so I won't volunteer something off the top of my head. The other question, though, of providing weapons. So we have already a history where the Europeans have done quite a bit. They don't get as much credit as they can. And they scale up very quickly to the point where they can make up the deficit that Ukraine will be left with if the United States withdraws. No, they won't be able to do that. But you have Ukraine building up certain capabilities. You do have the Europeans finally getting serious at the moment. The other day, I was looking at the list of the world's 25 top armament manufacturers. European countries are very well represented there. And in niche areas, they make some pretty significant stuff. Now, that said, they have a lot of work to do. If you read the reports of the parliamentary commissioner for the Bundestag, now Eva Hohl, before that Hans-Peter Bartels, the picture they paint of the German army is just awful.
True.
The French have enough, the French artillery stocks equal what Russia can lose sometimes in a month in Ukraine. The Europeans, correct me if I'm wrong, Chuck, haven't had a deployable armored division since the first Gulf War. So there's a big, steep climb. So I don't want to be a Pollyanna about this and say all of a sudden now Europe has woken up, the slumbering giant who's going to help Ukraine. But there's no other game in town if the United States withdraws, because Europeans then have to decide, are we going to let Ukraine go down in some sort of defeat, whatever that might be? I would expect a partition, not conquering all of Ukraine. It's indigestible. Or are we going to step up and do the best we can, concentrating our wills and our minds to help Ukraine stay in the game? And I think that sheer self-interest will lead them to do the latter. I don't see there are the Orbáns and the Ficos and so on. The Fico being the president of the prime minister of Slovakia, but by and large, the big entities are willing to change. If Scholz was there, I would be kind of skeptical. But Merz is a different kind of character, it seems to me.
Okay.
Wow, Rajan, this has been a fascinating hour, and I just hope you will join us again soon, because this has been, it's been wonderful to hear your deeply considered points of view, and also opening up some new ideas for me as well. And you put it in, as my father used to say, adjusted to the meanest levels of understanding. So made it very, very clear. Thank you.
I'm recording this to play back to my children. Well, listen, I really enjoyed talking to the two of you. Chuck, I follow your writings quite often. I know the two of you talk about this to a great extent, and you probably know much more about some of these issues than you were willing to let on to the audience. Just to people who are listening, I told Chuck and Alan before I came on that I have terrible allergies. It's obviously springtime in New York. I'm allergic to all kinds of things, so I'm sorry for sniffling, and if I sound a little off, that's the reason. But thank you both for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Professor Menon. It was a fascinating conversation, one that can go on, and this is why you'll be back very soon with Chuck and me here on Indications and Warnings.
That'll be terrific. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Rajan. See you soon.
Bye.